October 5th, 2011, Palo Alto, California. Inside a quiet bedroom, Steve Jobs lay surrounded by his family, his wife Lorene, his children, his sisters. He had been fighting pancreatic cancer for years, and everyone in that room knew this was the end. But then something strange happened. Jobs, who had barely been conscious, suddenly opened his eyes. He looked over the shoulders of his family, past them, at something no one else could see, and he said the same three words over and over. Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow. Then he closed his eyes for the last time. His sister Mona Simpson later described that moment in a eulogy at Stanford Memorial Church. She said his final look was one of wonder, like a boy seeing something extraordinary for the first time. But here is the question that still haunts people. What did Steve Jobs see? To understand why those last words matter so much, you have to understand who Steve Jobs really was. Not the myth, the actual person. He was born in San Francisco in 1955 to a Syrian immigrant father and an American graduate student mother. They were young, unmarried, and made the difficult decision to put him up for adoption. Paul and Clara Jobs took him in and raised him in Mountain View, right in the heart of what would later be called Silicon Valley. From the very beginning, Jobs was different. He was curious, rebellious, and obsessed with how things worked. He dropped out of Reed College after just one semester, not because he was a bad student, but because he couldn't see the point of spending his parents' money on courses that didn't interest him. Instead, he slept on dorm room floors, returned bottles for deposit money to buy food, and sat in on the classes he actually wanted to take. One of those classes was calligraphy. At the time, it seemed completely useless, but years later, that class inspired the beautiful typography of the original Macintosh. Jobs always said you can only connect the dots looking backward. In 1976, at the age of 21, he and Steve Wozniak started Apple Computer in a garage. Their first product, the Apple I, was basically a circuit board with no case, no keyboard, no screen. But within 4 years, Apple went public, and Steve Jobs became a millionaire. Then came the Macintosh in 1984, the computer that introduced the graphical user interface to the masses. But success didn't last. Jobs clashed constantly with Apple's board of directors. He was demanding, temperamental, sometimes cruel to the people around him. In 1985, Apple's board sided against him. Steve Jobs was fired from the company he had created. Most people would have given up. Jobs didn't. He started a new computer company called Next. He bought a struggling animation studio from George Lucas and turned it into Pixar. That little studio went on to make Toy Story, the first fully computer-animated feature film in history, and eventually became worth billions. Meanwhile, Apple was failing. Without Jobs, the company had lost its direction. By 1997, Apple was 90 days from bankruptcy, so they did the only thing they could. They brought Jobs back. What followed was the greatest corporate turnaround in history. The iMac, the iPod, iTunes, the iPhone, the iPad, each product didn't just sell well. It redefined its entire category. Jobs didn't invent the smartphone. He didn't invent the MP3 player. He didn't invent the tablet. But he understood something that engineers often miss. Technology means nothing if people don't love using it. He obsessed over every curve, every pixel, every animation. He rejected prototypes dozens of times until they felt right. Not looked right, felt right. He famously said that design is not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works. But there was something else driving Jobs. Something darker and more urgent than ambition. In 2003, Doctors found a tumor on his pancreas. He was diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer, one that was actually treatable with surgery. But Jobs refused the operation. For 9 months, he tried alternative treatments, special diets, herbal remedies, acupuncture. By the time he finally agreed to surgery, the cancer had spread. His biographer, Walter Isaacson, later said, Jobs told him he regretted the delay, that it was the one decision he wished he could take back. Even as his health declined, Jobs kept working. He unveiled the iPhone 4. He opened Apple's stunning new campus design. He continued to attend board meetings, even when he could barely stand. The last product launch he led in person was the iPad 2 in March 2011. He was visibly thinner, his face gaunt, but his mind was as sharp as ever. 6 months later, he was gone. But those final words, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow," people have spent years trying to interpret them. Some believe it was a spiritual vision. Jobs had studied Zen Buddhism for decades and had traveled to India as a young man seeking enlightenment. Perhaps in his final moment, he saw something that confirmed what he had always been searching for. Others are more skeptical. They say the brain releases a flood of chemicals during death, DMT, endorphins, a cascade of neural activity that can produce vivid hallucinations. Maybe Jobs was simply experiencing what every dying brain experiences. A trick of chemistry, not a window to another world. But here is what makes those words so powerful. Steve Jobs spent his entire life demanding perfection. He rejected anything that wasn't extraordinary. He once called a Google executive on a Sunday to tell him that the shade of yellow in Google's logo was wrong. And he was right. This was a man who never settled for good enough. So, when he looked past his family with that expression of wonder and said, "Oh wow," 3 times, it's hard to believe he was seeing nothing. Whether it was a spiritual vision, a chemical reaction, or something we simply cannot comprehend, Steve Jobs' last words tell us something important. Even at the end, even after building the most valuable company on Earth, even after changing how billions of people live their daily lives, Steve Jobs was still capable of being amazed. And maybe that is the most human thing about him. We will never know what Steve Jobs saw in his final moment, but his last words remind us of something we often forget. Life is not just about what we build, it is about what we see, and whether we still have the capacity to be struck by wonder. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe for more stories of extraordinary final moments, and leave a comment. What do you think Steve Jobs saw?